The success of the Shenzhou 5 mission shows China has truly grasped the technology of manned space flights.
Rocketing a human onto Earth's orbit is but a first step in China's program of manned space flights. Later, Chinese cosmonauts would attempt spacewalks as a prelude to building a space station. The long-term plan is to land space probes on the moon.
Actually, the orbital module of the Shenzhou 5 will remain in the short term on Earth's orbit. A mainland academic notes in future flights, more modules will be left in space, eventually linking up to form the prototype of a space station.
If the first module can be put to work in space in the future, we can put others into space and link them up so that the workspace would be much bigger. The Mir space station was formed like that.
The third step for China would be to build the likes of the International Space Station. Then Chinese scientists can work in microgravity conditions for longer on more experiments.
Those which have been carried to space. Each branch is different. Some of the ears of grain are small, some big. Some have matured earlier, some later. Some are tall, some short.
Li Luxiang studies breeding in space. He tried using radiation to help seeds grow bigger. He says Chinese sorghum, hyacinth beans and other space-bred species have been fruitful. But scientists are still grappling with the principles of breeding in space. Plants change genetically from being exposed to cosmic rays and microgravity, and scientists haven't been able to control the results. They'll only know after they grow the plants on Earth.
Many people think plant seeds or whatever, once they've taken a spin in space, will grow bigger or produce more abundantly back on Earth. That's a misconception. After being on a space mission, they'll only change a fraction. And this marginal change can be seen only by continuous breeding, screening and monitoring over a few years. It must be put through stabilizer tests.
But in 40 years of space probes, the US and Russia have never developed this kind of space resource. Scientist Mark Lee vets enterprise projects for NASA. He questioned the basis for breeding in space.
After so many years, no American scientist has dared to say that seeds which have been thrown in space, exposed to microgravity or cosmic radiation, or due to some other reason, would develop better and would change suddenly. I've been afraid of eating anything grown from such seeds.
Why don't the Americans and the Russians do space breeding? There are differing views on that in China. Some say it's because they don't have food shortages. I don't think so. First, I think space itself is already a resource. Whoever first grasps that resource will hold the future.
Microgravity is of micro-science importance. And really, looking back now, 13 years later, we still haven't gotten any important results from microgravity science.
Nicholas Bloombergen, Nobel Physics laureate, used to head the 30,000-strong American Physicist Society, which has long opposed sending man into space to do experiments.
From a strictly economic point of view, it doesn't pay. I mean, what pays is satellites to transmit electromagnetic signals. What also pays is all kinds of astronomical telescopes. X-ray, gamma rays, infrared, and also optical telescopes in space, like the Hubble telescope. That certainly has given lots of new scientific results.
Through the American Hubble telescope, you can see the farthest celestial bodies. But in order to save money, it wasn't tested before it was launched. In the end, a person had to be flown into space to do repairs, thus blowing the budget.
The total cost for the Hubble telescope was around $475 million. 10% is less than 50 million, but in saving that amount and just launching the telescope, a vital lens was found to be defective from the start. The Hubble project ended up costing 2 to 3 times more.
是吧？整个这个哈勃的费用，到最后增加2-3倍。
In the Beijing suburb of Huairou, China's National Observatory has erected a solar telescope which continuously tracks the movement of sunspots. In 2 years' time, China plans to launch a solar telescope onto Earth's orbit to continue its monitoring work, free of the atmosphere. The device has been dubbed the Chinese Hubble telescope. The next target is the moon. Under the Chang'e plan, named after a legendary woman who flew to the moon after taking a magic potion, experts say there are already projections of the landing spot.
The Soviets had pinpointed the northern end of the moon for both a soft landing and for a moon craft. The U.S. Apollo also focused on that area. We'll in future pick areas they haven't been to. We might focus on the south of the central part, the flat oceanic area.
Ouyang Xiyuan heads the moon exploration plans. He says it's too early to tell when a Chinese lunar landing would take place. The first step is to launch a satellite to orbit the moon.
The second step is to land and start probing on the moon and collect some specimens to take back to Earth. Those missions will not be manned. After that, our second phase would be to land a man to explore the moon.
What's the point of going to the moon? Ouyang says the long-term objective is to excavate rich mineral resources. Just the helium-3, which can be used in nuclear fusion, would be enough to supply Earth.
Just about 8 tons would be enough for 1 year's electricity supply in China. The U.S. needs 25 tons and the whole world 100 tons. There are about 1 million to 5 million tons on the moon. So there's no doubt the supply to meet the Earth's energy needs for 10,000 years or more.
But scientists have yet to ferret out how to generate electricity from nuclear fusion. If the moon's minerals are really that valuable, why have the Americans who pioneered lunar landing discontinued exploration? Experts estimate transporting 1 ton of stuff onto Earth's orbit costs 1 ton of gold. Chinese-American astronaut Taylor Wang says it's even more impractical to exploit the moon.
If you fly to the moon and are able to explore it and find the ground paved with top-grade diamonds, then to bring them back to Earth would cost you more than the diamonds are worth. So talk of developing business on the moon is totally futile.
He warns that space programs are not cost-effective. Back in 1985, he flew in a space shuttle to research the movements of air molecules in fluids floating in zero gravity. Just the equipment costs $4 to $5 million. After the 1986 space shuttle explosion, heightened safety standards were imposed on space equipment, so the same machines today would cost 7 times more.
I can see why they would like to put a Chinese man up in space, because it will promote all kinds of space technology, and then the Chinese will have maybe astronomical space labs and so on too. So from a political point of view, it's probably important to put a man in space, but don't make it an exclusive effort. Really look at unmanned space probes.
The Americans' experience is the cheapest and safest way to explore space is by remote control. The most amazing pictures are captured that way. But many believe China's first manned space venture is geared towards boosting the ruling party and uniting the nation. More on that after the break.
November 1988. But it's only made 1 flight. In the same year, the whole space shuttle project was aborted. The Buran model used for testing now resides in an amusement park in Moscow.
The Buran space shuttle was originally built to ferry supplies to space stations and to place and retrieve satellites in orbit. But after the Soviet Union collapsed, The multi-million-dollar program had to be curtailed, and this model has been relegated to become a theme park sideshow.
The space shuttle has been converted into a small cinema with repeated showings of the Buran's single flight. At that time, the Soviets poured its resources into the Buran shuttle project as a show of national strength, to the detriment of many of its other space projects. In the end, the kitty was emptied with more than $10 billion down the drain. On the 23rd of March 2001, a dazzling trail flashed across the skies over the Fiji Islands in the South Pacific. That was the Russian Mir space station in smithereens. There was a time when the Mir was the pride of the Russians and an annual cost of $2.5 billion. After being in operation for 15 years, it was finally destroyed due to a lack of funds. Decades of experience in the US and Russia have shown the world that large-scale space plans are not cost-effective and inevitably short-lived. But there is one advantage which money can't buy. On the streets of Moscow, many street names and road signs are space-related, such as Star Boulevard and Rocket Street. There's also the Soyuz brand cigarettes. Hutchinson is an American town of 40,000 people in Kansas. It's home to a museum with the most important Soviet space artifacts in the Western world.
On October 4th, 1957, this really changed everything, and the Cosmosphere is pleased to have an actual engineering model and backup unit of Sputnik 1. This is exactly like the unit Yuri Gagarin flew in to be the first human in space. You will not see this spacecraft anywhere else in the Western world.
Olenberger says the equipment was bought at a discount after the collapse of the Soviet Union. He feels it's a pity a space superpower had to sell off its pride and glory.
They tell an important story in the history of the human race for space.
In the early 60s, the Soviets were far superior to the US in space ventures. Russians remember those days as their most glorious. Grechko was a cosmonaut in that shining era. He remembers many songs with space themes. Space exploration can evoke tremendous national pride and patriotism.
Once the race to the moon began, Russia was lagging behind, couldn't catch up. At the time, we were not confident we could send a man to the moon and bring him safely back. At the time, many people wrote to the Aerospace Ministry saying they were willing to fly into space and didn't mind if they can't return.
These old posters touted the Soviets' achievements in space as a reflection of communism's success. And for optimum propagandistic effect, an important criterion for choosing a cosmonaut was physical attributes. And that's why Yuri Gagarin was chosen to be the first man in space.
At the time, the Nobel Prize Committee planned to award the designer of the satellite. But when it asked who the designer was, Khrushchev replied that Russia launched the satellite and the launch pad was socialism.
Grechko is a senior Communist Party member. He admitted the space program in those days was geared to promoting the superiority of the national system.
In those days, the Russian society was under an authoritarian system. We might not be able to compete with America in many areas, but in the most crucial area, we could concentrate our strength in a narrow sphere where democratic countries could not. We were able to achieve greater results than the U.S.
Implementation of any space plan is based on political needs rather than scientific needs. The Apollo project was a confrontation of free democratic Western countries against autocratic communist ones.
The space race between the US and the Russians began when the then Soviets launched the first man-made satellite in 1957. In 1961, Russian Yuri Gagarin became the first man in space. 4 years later, another Russian, Leonov, became the first human to walk in space. Lagging on all fronts, US President John F. Kennedy decreed the nation's resources be poured into catching up.
Time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
In 1969, the Americans finally caught up by landing a man on the moon, placing the stars and stripes there. At the time, the Soviets had spent some $2 billion on equipment for lunar exploration. It has since been left on the back burner. The Soviets regarded being second as meaningless. Now, the Chinese are proud to be the third nation to send a man to orbit the Earth. 40 satellites and spaceships, as well as 1,000 missiles, have taken off from the Jiuquan launch pad. China insists in sending its first manned spaceflight, it was not joining the space race. Some in the US agreed.
In terms of the manned space program, my opinion is that the primary purpose is only prestige.
Dean Chang says China launched its first manned spaceflight largely for political reasons.
Very few countries in the world have all of these capabilities of space power. So there is a domestic factor in terms of confirming what the party has done for China. There is an international factor in terms of making China the equivalent internationally. And there is an element in terms of uniting all Chinese.
Washington is certainly keeping a close eye on China's first manned spaceflight and future space program. Former Senator Robert Walker notes China has been training its cosmonauts in spacewalking, and that's a sure indication where its ambitions lie.
That this was more than simply putting a couple of humans in a capsule and sending them into space. When you start doing EVAs, you are doing real serious work in space. You're doing assembly work, you're doing work outside of the vehicles. And so the fact that the Chinese crew is there training for that told us that this, in fact, is a very aggressive program.
Walker believes China will send a man to the moon within 10 years. Walker has been pushing for a restart of the US moon missions, which have been shelved for some 30 years.
If another nation goes and actually sets up a permanent presence there, I think it'll be a wake-up call for the American people. And the question is whether or not that translates politically into a desire for the United States to be more aggressive with what it's doing with regard to the moon or other planetary missions in the future.